Hi, and welcome back to ManaTutor MTG Draft. In today's episode, we'll be going over the poor performing foundations cards, specifically cards performing at a grade of D or D-, and give our thoughts on why they're performing so poorly and in what circumstances you should consider playing them. Bringing insight to what cards are performing poorly is one of the most direct ways to improve your set-specific win rate, so you avoid putting them into your deck unless the context of the deck calls for it. And because the educational portion of our content is getting such high engagement, we're going to start by reviewing the cards and follow up with a more casual, open discussion about our thoughts of the format. So stay tuned for that. Matt, ready to dive into the cards?
Yeah, let's dive in.
So here we have limitedgrades.com for foundations, which maps the 17 lands win rate across grade tiers. And like we said, we're going to be looking at Ds and D-. We'll avoid Fs because those are a little bit more self-explanatory on why you should play them and really basically should never play any of them. But the Ds and D-, they have occasional one-offs in certain situations where you should be playing them. So we'll cover all those and we'll rapid fire through them. Up first, we have Raise from the Past. This card, it just doesn't get enough value out of it. You usually don't have enough 2-drops in your graveyard to make this worth paying the 4 mana. Even when you do, all you're doing is returning a bunch of 2s, and there's much better ways to go wide, quite frankly. So it doesn't really have a place in any deck, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would say that it can have a very limited use in very specific decks. It can be a good potential build around in a very like aggro cheap white black or white red. But you know, like I agree with you completely. I think it's very niche case, but almost never played. Next up, we have Stroke of Midnight, and so this is at best going to kill a powerful creature that your opponent has. But it's also going to leave them with a 1/1, which is not really the best way to remove it. There's so much better removal in this. You've got Hero's Downfall, you've got Bake into a Pie, you've got Stab, you've got Luminous Rebuke. All of these either at common or uncommon, and this is just it's not good. I don't know that there is a good use case for this one.
I do see if you're desperate for removal, it's viable. You
Right.
have to be desperate, though.
You have to be very desperate, yes.
Yeah. There have been versions of this that leave the opponent with a 2/2, which is just, I think, unplayable. It's just such a big, a big creature, a 2/2. This version of a 1/1, to see how much every bit of power matters. Just look at the card that made a 0/2, or it removed your opponent's creature but made it a 0/2 in Duskmourn. That was a good card because of the 0 power left behind.
Right.
The 1 power can kill a decent amount of creatures in the set and can combine with other creatures to kill other creature, right? It's just giving your opponent too much.
And it gives, at the very least, it gives them a blocker still. It doesn't clear the board. It doesn't clear the way. Like you said, if you're desperate for removal, sure, this can work in a pinch. Or if it's one of those, if you're just trying to take out something that could kill you, sure, that this will do that. But I mean, it's not. It is not premium removal, and it should probably be one of the lower removals you play.
Up next, we got Divine Resilience. This kind of effect just isn't usually worth a card. You'd rather than make one creature be indestructible, you would rather just have another threat, because when you draw into this and the board is clear, it's a do nothing. And that really matters in this set. Well, I think we'll probably go over this a bit more when we talk about how the set feels, but every card really matters. And yeah, you get the upside that you can make all your creatures indestructible, but the situation doesn't come up enough to warrant that. And so if you have a huge bomb that is cheap enough that you think you could wait to play that bomb and save this up, I can see a circumstance there, but that's really it.
Right. So last up in white here for the Ds, we have Heir Apparent. Heir Apparent, I should say, not Heir Apparent. And this one I think is pretty self-explanatory, right? It's a 2/2 for 2, basically. Like the only good use case for this is if you can get 4 or 5 of these in a single deck. And that's just unlikely because you don't know that that's going to happen. And taking this early, you're really gambling, right? You're gambling the fact. Now, you're probably going to be the only person in your pod who's going to draft these. So if you happen to get lucky and there's 4 or 5 copies that go around, you might get them all, or you probably will get them all. But That's just such a risk. And, while this isn't a terrible thing to play if you're really starved for 2 drops, there's so many better ones.
Even if you try to catch them all, don't get me wrong. This is a card I would play when I'm desperate for 2s. Like it's a 2/2 for 2, and you can get them late. So the other problem is everyone in white that if they don't have another pick to take, they might take this as just a security blanket for their 2 drops, and so you can't even expect to get them all.
You might. I mean, I would just say that other people playing white are probably also not prioritizing this highly. So, but your point is well taken. Like if 3 people are playing white in your pod, the white's going to be pretty scarce, and other people might take it.
Up next at D-, we have Armasaur Guide. It's just one of those creatures that doesn't have enough stats. You get a 4/4 for 5. Yes, it has vigilance. That's nice. But you really need some like enter the battlefield effect. Now, attacking with 3 creatures, this can do it right away, sure. But that's not enough. You're still just getting your 5/5 for 5 out of it. And you need to be doing more at 5 mana. It needs some enter the battlefield ability, some way to recur another creature or something. Or we expect more of our 5 mana cost cards.
Right. And I would just put this card in the category of win more. Right. You have to be able to attack in to use this card, and you have to be able to attack in with 3+ creatures in order to use this effectively. And while, yes, this one can also operate on the defensive, you can attack and still keep it because of the vigilance. But if you're attacking in every turn with 3 creatures, you're probably winning already. The effect is fine, but it's unnecessary because you probably already won the game with that. So next up, we have Twin Blade Blessing. So for 3, you get a flash enchantment that gives a creature double strike. I've actually had this kill me, so I'm not like it's not the worst card, right? It can in fact win you the game. The thing is just for the cost and the ability to get 2 for 1 with this, it's not generally worth it. There's so much instant speed removal, and if you're probably going to put this on your biggest creature. And your biggest creature is already a target. So you're just giving your opponent much, much more reason to kill that creature as quick as they can, assuming they have the removal. Now, if they don't have the removal, great. You probably win the game with this. But betting on your opponent to not have removal isn't a really great, strategy most of the time.
And last up, we have Crystal Barricade. It's got a decent butt there in the 4. Yeah, but all these creatures that have 0 power, like the same reason we said leaving a 1/1 was so much more important than having it an 0/2, when you're removing your opponent's creature, it really hurts to not have any power to contribute towards combat. And so it can buy you some time, but you know what? They can just fly over you.
Yeah, and I would say, the effect of giving or preventing all non-combat damage dealt to your creatures is great, except for the fact that most removal isn't deal damage based. Like red is for sure, and there's a couple of spell Abrade, obviously, things like that. But Abrade can just kill this, and the person's probably just going to use the Abrade to kill this, and then it doesn't matter, right? But it's still not going to evade most removal that just destroys or exiles the creature. So next up in blue, we have Rune Sealed Wall. So again, this is, like you said with Crystal Barricade, right? This is just, you're getting 0 power for mana. And a 0/6 though is somewhat useful in some circumstances, but more useful than that, honestly, is the surveillability on this. This is one where you can see a use for this, and that use is specifically in like a blue-black control situation. This card is not a bad card. It helps you get to threshold. I still don't prioritize it super highly, but it's certainly playable, and it's one that I would even consider like my 23rd playable in a blue-black deck where I may not have a bunch of things. But this is it is a security blanket at a 0/6. So
up next we have Homunculus Horde. It's an interesting card that can copy itself, and that copy exponentially happens, but you have to draw your second card each turn. When it goes off, it can win the game. The key is getting it to go off and doing so in a way that this doesn't get disrupted. For 4 mana, you get a 2/2. 2 toughness really sucks in the set in general, with all the common removal being reaching 2 creatures. So it's just a little too finicky. and you have to invest in building your deck around the drawing too, which there's other payoffs, but usually, you know, when you pick up a humongous horde, you are then prioritizing all that and putting your deck all around that strategy. And it's just too much investment for something that's too finicky.
Right. I will say I agree with everything you said, but I picked up this card once. I did build a deck around it. I went 5-3. It was actually a pretty fun deck, and every time I got this card out on the board, I won the game. Because you get things like Strix Lookout, you get Spectral Sailor, just tons of ways to potentially draw that second card for free or cheap. Dreadwing Scavenger. The most common way I won the game: turn 3 Dreadwing Scavenger, turn 4 this. And if they didn't have removal, the game was over. So again, everything you said is valid, and I agree that this card is not amazing. But it is really funny when you get it, and then you get 2, and then you have 4, and then you have 8, and they are, your opponent just GG's out because there's nothing they can do at that point.
This is certainly a threat. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
Like, yeah, if you can get this out and get it to the point where your opponent doesn't have removal, and then you have an engine to trigger this, for sure, that can win games. And
Right.
I've been beaten by it. I haven't played it myself yet, but so I guess the point kind of being, this is a deck I think that you can build and will be fun to do, and worth trying.
Right.
But it will, more often than not, you'll stumble with it. So
Right.
it's a risk. Are you going to get the right version of the deck versus are you not? And so just,
Right.
I guess you either need to take this early and completely commit to building around it, cut off all the drawing cards from your opponents to ensure that you get it. Or if you pick it up late and you happen to already be in that lane and you know that lane's open,
Yeah.
then you're just free to go for it.
Right. Yep. And I will say the funniest use case I had for this is I had 8 of these out on the board, and my opponent cast Blasphemous Edict, and I countered it, and then they just quit the game. So
Nice.
All right. So next up, we have a card that I don't actually think belongs in this position, but obviously the stats put it here. We've got Tolarian Tear. So this card's a reprint, obviously, but it was pretty good last time around, and I think it's still pretty good. But you must be playing a control deck for this to be good. So you're talking a blue-red spells deck, a blue-black control, or a blue-white control. If you can pull that off, I just trophied with a deck that played 2 of these. But again, it was almost all control spells. So it was blue-white tempo control, and that's the deck you have to put this in. You need minimum 10 instants and sorceries to make this a pretty viable card to put in your deck. So I would say that's the limited use for it. Other than that, then yeah, it is kind of a D.
Yeah, I agree. I think too many people are putting this in decks where it shouldn't be. And because the set was Dominaria United was more favorable to this card, this is a worse card in this set, I do believe.
Yeah.
But if you have the right deck for it, it still can be a good card. So I think this is one of those where the grade is low, but it has its particular use case where it's a good card.
Yeah, I cast this for 1 mana in one game. So I mean, it can be pretty devastating if and when you get around to it. But
up next, we have Run Away Together. Usually this card isn't that great, and it still isn't that great in the set. That said, there are a lot of enter the battlefield abilities on cheap creatures that can make this interesting to run. In fact, I just trophied with a blue-black deck where I sent my deck over to Matt, and I was wondering what cards I should cut. I had Run Away Together cut, and I had 5 Burglar Rats, though. And so Matt suggested I throw that in, and I'm like, you're right. I think you want to run one of these when you have 5 Burglar Rats and can just turn it into a unconditional removal. And just it in general played out well. I had a lot of things I want to protect as well for removal. I had a couple bombs, so it was a Swiss Army knife, and I liked having one of it in my deck. I think most of the time you don't want it. 95% of decks out there. So again, I think this is being played in too many decks, but it has its use case.
Right. Any deck that has ETB effects is great with this. But if you don't have enough of those ETB effects, it's not worth it. There's better cards. So that I agree with everything you said. All right, next we have Imprisoned in the Moon. Obviously, this is a 3-cost removal, but you're basically giving your opponent an extra land, and that's the problem with it. It's like we talked about with Stroke of Midnight. You're giving your opponent too much value for it. Now, I can see a very niche use for this, which is if your opponent is kind of stuck on lands and only has one land of a specific color, you can enchant their land and it no longer can produce whatever color they may need. So not totally useless, but the fact is it's mostly useless, right? There's better removal. Now, that said, this is a semi-permanent form of removal in blue, which is not as common. So you may find a use for it in a blue deck, but you're generally going to be in blue-red or blue-white or blue-black, and all of those have access to your removal. So you shouldn't necessarily be relying on blue for your removal spells, like permanent removal spells like this. Banishing Light is much better, right?
Yeah, like this is if you literally have no way to answer anything, you can run one of these type of thing. That's what this is there for. Other than that, I would steer clear. Up next, we have Erudite Wizard. You get a 2/3 for 3. When you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Like we said before, stats 2 mana 2/3s that don't have a whole lot of upside is just a little bit weak, and you have to trigger this one in a way that's not too common to trigger. There's much better things to be doing with your drawing a card spells. It's serviceable as a 3-drop if you need like an extra creature at the 3-drop slot. It has a place there, but again, you really have to be desperate as that is your like 23rd playable. I think I'm not purposely trying to run this even in most of my draw 2 decks, but it will sometimes make the cut in my draw 2 decks.
I agree completely. This is another one of those. If you've got 6 or 7 ways to draw 2, 2 or 3 copies of Dreadwing Scavenger, Strix Lookout, a Spectral Sailor, other ways, to do that. This is not a bad 3-drop necessarily. I mean, Dreadwing Scavenger is better, but in the long run, this is going to get big and it's going to force your opponent to deal with it. But you have to be able to do it reliably, and that's going to be the challenge. And if you can't, this is just a 2-mana or a 3-mana 2/3. Next up, we have Aetherize. This is one of those cards that the text on it looks great. You think, well, I can just return all my opponent's creatures to hand when they attack. The problem is, it's one of those, you may hit the jackpot, but you may just completely fizzle with it. Like, it may be completely useless in your hand, and generally you don't want cards that may be completely useless in your hand.
Up next, we have Mocking Sprite. Looks almost like a Windrake with upside, but it's not. The 1 toughness really hurts it, especially in this set when you have a bunch of 1/1 flyers running around that can block this and destroy it. Also, at 3 mana, at that point, making your instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less. It's a little bit slow for that. You're not playing things too much higher up the mana curve in instants and sorceries that you'll get the bonus sometimes, but not overly reliably. I'm almost always cutting this from my decks. In fact, I think one of your recent decks, Matt, you had it was your Tolarian Tarot deck, right? Where you had a bunch of instants and sorceries. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. This is the deck for it. But
even in that, it's not great.
Yeah.
You were right. And my original build of the deck, I had 2 copies of this in there. And, you recommended cutting it and swap. I can't remember exactly what we swapped it out for, but the deck was better and it trophied. So, no doubt. If there was ever a deck to play it in, I think I had like 13 instants in that deck. That was the deck. But even then, it just, I trophied without it, right? Then that's all you need. That's all you really need to know about it, is that it made 0 difference to not include it, and probably made the deck better. So next up, we have Clinquant Sky Mage. Stat wise, this is one of those. This is horrible, right? You're paying 4 mana for a 1/1 flyer that doesn't really impact the board immediately. And sure, this is whenever you draw any card, put a +1/+1 counter on it. but you're basically waiting, 3+ turns for this thing to actually get somewhere. And that's a lot of time. Now, in a control deck situation, maybe you have that time. Maybe you have a way to draw multiple cards, right? That can make it better. But the fact of the matter is there's just much better things to play in your 4-drop slot than this. And without a lot of extra ways to draw cards, it's realistically not going to get there. And then when it gets big, your opponent's just going to use their removal on it. And they've got time to plan for that, right? They know it's going to get bigger. It's predictable. And so it's not like you can pull one over on your opponent with this card usually.
Yeah, this is a creature I think I'm never playing. Maybe at the end of the set, we'll turn back and I find the one case where I think it's a good card, but I don't think so. Tell us in the comments below if you think you have such a deck. I'd be interested in seeing it, but it's just, even with all the card draw, it's too slow. You've got to play this at 4, then do your card draw stuff. And that's like usually in that case, 2 turns in a row that you are not doing anything to the board other than putting a 1/1 and then drawing a bunch of cards, right? In Magic in 2024, that's too slow.
Right. I will say the very niche specific use might be if you have this and then immediately on your turn 5, you have the 5-cost draw 3, right? Okay. Now you've made it an okay card, but again, just merely okay.
Up next, we have Aegis Turtle. This is just a repeat of the other cards that we had. 05, it doesn't have any power. That's bad.
Right. I will say that the one difference here is this is not a defender, right? So if for some reason you have a way to give it some power, it's not the worst card, but I mean, I could see this in a deck where you do have some +1/+1 counter generators as an early cheap creature, but there are just also better choices for that too, like Healer's Hawk, right? If you're playing counters, you're probably in white. Healer's Hawk is a better 1-drop. So
I think the only 0-power creature I am putting in any deck in this set was the 06 at 3 that Surveilled. Don't get me wrong, it's not like these cards have 0 value. If you need to buy time, they can do that. But there are better ways to do that, and I don't think I'm putting these in any decks.
So last up in blue, we have an Offer You Can't Refuse. Looks good on its face of counter a target non-creature spell for 1, but you're giving your opponent 2 free mana. You're giving your opponent more mana than you spent on this spell. That's how bad it is. There's nothing else to say about it. It is very bad. Don't play it.
It sucks when you get beat by this, though, but
that's fair. I guess it would feel really bad to get beat by this, but I
agree. Don't play it.
Yeah.
In black, we have Revenge of the Rats. This is a card that I think has use case. I've been drafting it medium low, and I think cutting it from every single deck. Basically, I think I played it in 1 deck so far, but it has beat me, and I do see value to it. You need to be a deck that is playing enough creatures and still expects to go in the long game. And that can be somewhat rare. It does benefit from things like the Billowing Shriek Mass that mills a bunch of cards as well. Like that can help trigger this to get into enough creatures. It also benefits from things that help you draw cards off of the 1/1s, like the Amulet that lets you sack things. So if you have all that going for you, you could consider playing a Revenge of the Rats. Otherwise, I'd probably stay away from this.
Yeah, I think I agreed. The other part about it that just like really, there's 2 parts about this that really suck. It's they come in tapped, and this is a sorcery. So best case, you are getting a bunch of attackers next turn, and that's slow, and it gives your opponent time to respond, like prepare for it, deal with it, any number of things. And if this was an instant, great card, right? Probably full grade higher almost, right? Maybe not quite that much, but it would be a lot better, right? Because you could play it on your opponent's end step, get all those rats, attack in with them. But sorcery speed is just not going to cut it, especially if they come in tap. You can't even block with them. So it's not even like an emergency get a bunch of blockers card. All right. So next up, we have Crypt Feaster. You get 3/4 menace for 4. Threshold becomes a 5/4 essentially. It's understated, right? I've had somebody attack me with this and it hurts, but there's plenty of ways to deal with it, and it's nothing special. I wouldn't say never play it, but it's probably one of the first cards I would cut in most decks.
At 4 mana, it needs to be, there's enough other good things at 4 mana. It's hard to find a spot for this ever. And you really want your 4 mana to do something else, like as it comes into play or something,
Right.
rather than just be a creature and an understated one at that. Midnight Snack. I never liked this card. I was wondering, I remember when grading this originally, I was like, what am I missing? It's an uncommon. I feel like there's some combo or something that this should go with. And I just don't really think there is. I mean, you have to, it costs you a card up front. Then maybe you can get food tokens. Like, yeah, it's deep. It's not hard to enable the raid, and then you can maybe enable that a couple of times and gain a few life. But you have to even, pay the mana to get the life from the food token too.
Yeah.
And eventually you can sacrifice it and do some draining. But it wouldn't drain for that much. It's hard to really get that much going in life gain.
I will say I have played this and I've had it perform well, but it's in a very specific deck. It is in a black-white deck where you have flyers that give you life gain, right? If you have enough of those and you can trigger them reliably, you can, your Healer's Hawk can attack in and get you the food token every turn. And then sooner or later you can blow this up in your opponent's face for 7, 8 on turn 5, turn 6. It can be done, but it's again a very niche case. And so if you've got that nuts deck where this would fit perfectly, I'd say it may actually be a fairly good card, but it has to be that specific deck.
And you have to be lucky with that deck, I feel like, too,
right,
to get the scenario to play out.
Right. Well, I mean, if you have enough life gainers, you really need to have enough various triggers, right? You need the several Healer's Hawks. You need like the Dazzling Angel. You need other things. You need ways to trigger your life gain every turn, basically. And if you can do that, great. This is an okay card to play, but it never rises above okay, even in those spots. All right, next up we have Exsanguinate. You're wasting a card unless you have nothing better to play. This is just not going to get it done for you. And thinking you're going to exsanguinate your opponent for 10, okay, that requires 12 mana. I'd say the actual best case use for this is not in a black-white deck, but in a black-green deck where you have tons of ramp and you can potentially get this, up to 7 or 8 super quick. Then it's not terrible, but it's still not good. And you can, if you've got 7 or 8 mana to spend, you should be playing other stuff generally that actually impacts the board more directly than just draining your opponent.
In red, we have Axguard Cavalry. This again is just a serviceable 2-drop. I've played plenty of these. I'm not prioritizing them. I just end up with them as my, one of my last picks in a given pack type of thing. But I will say it has won me games when you have bombs that trigger off of attacks, like the Tyrant Dragon that when it attacks deals 4 damage to something and 3 damage to 2 other things. I've given that haste that can win the game. Things like that. I consider it like filler 2-drop that is actively decent when I have a bomb like that.
Yep, absolutely. Agree 100%. Goblin Surprise. This is I'm somewhat surprised to see this as low as it is. I do think this card is fairly good in certain circumstances, but it's only in certain archetypes, right? This is great in the Rakdos Sacrifice deck. I think that is the deck that this falls most naturally into, and I have actively played 2 copies of this in a deck like that and done really well with it. Because you have the option to create the tokens, or if you have, the Infestation 1/1, that becomes a 1/1 flyer. Getting 2 or 3 of those out maybe and pumping those in the air can be really good if your opponent's not expecting it. So there are some good uses for it, but particularly in that deck, I have not played a Boros deck yet. But I imagine it could go well in Boros as well if you have a very strong go wide strategy there. But it's beyond those, it's not worth the 3 mana. You've got other things you can play.
I have played this in Boros. I liked it in Boros, and that was the one spot. And it has to be the particular. I mean, most of Boros is a go wide strategy, but you have to draft it as a go wide version, and then this can end the game pretty quickly if you go wide enough. And have this with multiple copies, where some you're making even more 1/1s, and others you're then pumping everything. So I liked it there. I think that's the best place for this. I have drafted it as a basically filler in the sacrifice Rakdos based decks, and then end up cutting them because I had other better things to do. But I guess my point being, I could see it. Like I put it in with Revenge of the Rats, right? Like that could be a way to go wide at the end of the game and pump everything. But I ended up cutting that whole package. But try it in Rakdos maybe, but otherwise Boros go wide is where this is at.
Right. I'll say the use case for the Rakdos deck is if you have enough ways to sacrifice the 1/1s, right? That's really what it's going to come down to. If you've got 2 copies of Vampire Gourmand and the Ghoul that sacrifices as well, like a few copies of that. If you've got the 1 cost removal spell, I forget the name of it, that sacrifice a creature, then it's like it's actively good because you have ways to use those 1/1s other than being chump blockers, right? But even then, there are other ways to do that as well. So
up next, we have Incinerating Blast. Just a little bit overstated. Again, a little understated. Again, this is one of those cards that if you are needing removal, I think it has a spot. It's basically where you came up a little bit short on your good removal, and that's it.
Yep. I agree completely. I mean, you don't want to be paying 5 mana to deal 6 damage at sorcery speed. Like that's honestly one of the worst parts about this card as well. There's no reason why this could not have been an instant for the absurd cost. So next up we have Flamewake Phoenix. 2/2 flyer with haste for 3 is not necessarily terrible stats. However, the attacks each turn if able is probably going to just get this killed more times than not, and your opponent is then going to start prioritizing all of your power 4 or greater creatures. And I think this is just a problem with the red-white deck, or the red-green deck in general, is that if you've got a bunch of things that trigger on power 4 or greater creatures, your opponent's just going to kill those creatures. I've done that to people, and it just completely negates the entire purpose of their deck. Not necessarily a bad card, but it's very situational. If you can bring this back every turn, great. But it's again one of those win more things. If you've got a power 4 or greater creature just sitting on the board and you can bring this thing back every turn to attack in, you're probably winning anyway.
I will play this in the red-green deck. I'll play this even in some other decks where I have enough 4 power creatures, but it's playing it as maybe not a 23rd playable, but like 20th or something like that. It's just not that great of a card. This has to be up there, I imagine, as one of the cards that is picked the highest but performs the least.
Probably.
It looks like it's really good, but it's not that much better than a Windrake. Up next, we have Thrill Possibility, one that is decent when you need to be playing a whole bunch of spells, the blue-red deck, and otherwise not that great. This always ends up being around a D. Don't really have much to add. There's a spot for it. It helps you be able to play more lands too, so you can reach those and ditch them. So there's a spot as a 23rd playable, but you're looking to avoid it.
Next up, we have Fire Spitter Whelp. It's more or less a Windrake that gives you the ability to ping your opponent every time you cast a non-creature or dragon spell. That's fine, but it's one of those, you have to have the non-creature spells to make it useful. And a lot of times in those decks, there are better cards to be playing. And so, I mean, you'll note, we'll come to one later with Firebrand Archer, right? But that's similarly not particularly great, just being able to ping your opponent every time you play a non-creature spell. And so, yeah, I mean, not much more to say about it, I guess.
Yeah, I do think this card is better than a D and in general, and that it comes down on the fact that blue-red is bad enough in the set, like has pretty bad stats. So while I don't at all think it's a great card, I in general I would put this more at like somewhere within the C range, and I think it is being brought down by that. Up next, we have Electro Duplicate. it's just not enough value for the card. You don't want to be paying 3 for a temporary creature. You want to be able to get a permanent in play.
Right.
There's just the better card in the Act of Treason
Yeah,
effect that's out there,
absolutely.
where you can
I was going to
steal
say
from your
exactly
opponent
that.
and do this. Yeah, it has flashback, but if you don't want to be paying 3, you probably don't want to be playing 4 for it either. So I don't see this as a card I'd really ever play unless I wanted to have fun with some big bomb that I got and copy it, but other than that, not for winning.
All right. So next up, we have Rite of the Dragon Caller. So, for 6 mana and enchantment, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you create a 5/5 red dragon creature with token. I mean, this is all another one of those that probably is like very highly picked and then does not pan out, right? Don't get me wrong. If you can get this card out and then you have an instant or sorcery, even 1 or 2 instants or sorceries, you'll probably win the game. But there's a lot of removal that can deal with this still, especially in green, white. It's more than often not going to pan out, and the fact that it costs 6 means you're probably not playing. You're not playing it till turn 6 usually, at best, and that's if you hit a land drop all the time, and then you're tapping out to do it, so you're not getting any value out of it until next turn. It's a 6 mana do nothing card, and that's hard to justify.
Yeah, don't like the card. I will say I will play it in a nuts blue-red deck that is doing all the instants and sorceries because I want to make this happen. And it's great when it does, but I cards that do nothing at 6 mana the turn they come into play are a tough sell in limited.
Absolutely.
Up next, we have Shivan Dragon, probably my most overrated card, although I think I also said that I could totally see that I'm biased on this one as well, and it turns out I was biased. But Sarah Angel is doing well, though, so
Yeah.
So that one I was, even maybe biased, but I had Sarah Angel rated higher than Shivan Dragon, so I'm not surprised
Right.
Shivan Dragon's the one that is not doing as well. It costs 6 mana. Once you're costing 6, you really need to be doing something big. This can win you the game when it goes unanswered, and you can pump it up and fly over your opponent. But just getting a 5/5 flyer for 6 with a little bit of upside when it can eventually attack is not enough. It needs to do something a turn it comes into play.
Right. Yeah. I will say it's funny that this and Rite of the Dragon Caller are ranked the same because objectively speaking, this card is much better, I think, than Rite of the Dragon Caller because it is not, that is a 6 mana do nothing. This is a 6 mana. At least you get a 5/5 immediately off of it versus that one having to basically wait a turn. And so I would much rather play this card than Rite of the Dragon Caller, and this one's uncommon and that one's mythic. So
yeah, and this one I will play a lot more often too. Like if I need top end, I will still play this card even though it's a D-. I think it's serviceable top end. I'm just not taking it extremely highly. Granted, though, I can still see myself doing something like 7th picking this. Like if I see everyone's passing on it, I'll take it as a reasonable signal of red. But I need to know that it's in an open enough color type of thing.
So next up, we kind of talked about this one already. Firebrand Archer. It's a lot like the Fire Splitter Whelp in that it's two for a 2/1, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, deals 1 damage. It's actually worse because the other one gives you any dragon spell as well, and that one has 2 toughness. I'd much actually rather pay the 1 additional mana for the 2 toughness and the flying versus this, which basically dies to anything and doesn't do anything. This is if you are really starved for your 2 drops, okay. Sometimes you have to play this card, but you should be looking for almost anything else.
I will say the 2 drops on this bad list are the ones I am most often going to play. Right? Like, sometimes you just want a number of 2 drops and you don't really care what they are in order to fill that slot. So this does have a role to play in that, but it's because I got stuck with it, and that's my 2 drop, and it's no other reason than that.
Right. And the trap I think people fall into, especially with this card or cards like this, right, is you're thinking, oh, this is going to stick around and I'm going to get to do like 5 or 6, damage casting instants and sorceries. No, the reality is you're going to chump block with this, probably turn 4 because you don't have anything else to chump block with. And then it has basically done nothing for you except save you a bit of damage.
Up next, Seismic Rupture, deal 2 damage each creature without flying. It's just a a blank enough of the time, and it also kills your own creatures. And yeah, it's it's interesting. Board wipes are good in this set when they're unconditional board wipes, like Day of Judgment and the exile creatures thing in black. But you want to ensure you are killing your opponent's good creatures. You don't want to be killing all their small ones. Now, I can see this still being like a sideboard card in best of 3, but not anything for best of 1.
I will say that the one limited use that I could see for this is if you're playing a blue-white or a blue-red, and you have basically exclusively flying creatures. Maybe one copy somewhere in there, but even then, there's better cards.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Bulk Up. For 2 mana, you get to double target creature's power until end of turn, and it's got flashback for 6. Again, on paper, this sounds fantastic, right? If you've got a 5/5 flyer like Shivan Dragon and you attack in with it, you can make it a 10/5 and probably kill your opponent. But in practice, I mean, your opponent, if they have instant speed for removal, you're just getting 2 for 1. And while this has flashback and that helps a little bit, the cost on it is so high, and the fact that your opponent knows it's coming at that point when it's in your graveyard, it's going to more often than not just sit there and not do much.
We also have Spitfire Lagak, just low enough stats that ping on landfall isn't enough to make up for missing another power, and even like a 4-mana 4/4 I wouldn't even love either. So just not an efficient creature.
Right. So next up we have Garruk's Uprising. Again, on paper this sounds good, but a lot of times it's going to be a pay 3 mana do nothing, at least initially. Right, playing this turn 3, you're probably not going to have a creature with power 4 or greater. Right, I think there's exactly one creature in the 2-drop slot that has 4 power, and that's the Cerberus that untaps only when a creature dies. If you've got that card and you've got this, great. That's probably that might be good. But the problem is you're more than likely not going to have that, and it's going to enter and do nothing. Now, giving all your creatures trample is not a bad side ability. So you can see a limited case for this. If you've got enough big creatures, but none of them have trample in your deck, I might want to play a copy of this just to sort of give myself a semi-overrun kind of ability. But beyond that, they're generally going to be better cards to play in your 3-drop slot than this.
Right. I'd rather just, if you're going to go into green anyways, just get an overrun and do it the right way.
Right.
Blanchwood Armor, I mean, I can see this in mono green. I don't think there's enough of a reason to go in mono green to play this. And as such, I don't see a spot for it.
Right. And you're just setting yourself up to get 2 for 1. I mean, this is not like Snakeskin Veil or other cards that'll actually protect you from the 2 for 1. This is just going to get you 2 for 1 most of the time. Next up, Apothecary Stomper. For 6 mana, you get a 4/4 Vigilance, and it puts 2 +1/+1 counters on a target creature, or you gain 4 life. So best case scenario, you're getting a 6/6 Vigilance for 6, which is not, amazing. It's not terrible. It's, a little bit above rate. This is good in a green-white where you have triggers that trigger off putting counters on things. Beyond that, I don't think it really it might be a 23rd playable in some decks, but usually not.
We used to get cards that were like 6/6 trample for 6 gain through life when it came into play. It doesn't have to like split up the abilities and stuff like that. Yeah, it's just not quite powerful enough to make it.
Right.
Wildwood Scourge, it's simply you're always overpaying. I don't like that. Yes, you can get more +1/+1 counters on it as you add counters to other things, but that takes setup, and I don't like to overpay up front and then have some setup that's relatively hard to do. Try to make this a good card.
Right. And it without trample, it doesn't matter how big it gets, as long as your opponent has a blocker. Now, there are other ways to give it trample, obviously, but I generally don't like the pay X +1 essentially to get an XX that doesn't have anything else that going for it. Now, this has something small going for it, but it's still it's not a lot. Next up, we have Reclamation Sage. if your opponent's playing an artifact or enchantment you want to blow up and you got this, great. I would maybe play this card in a green deck. I actually have not drafted a green deck yet in this format, mostly because I think we talked about this on a previous episode, green is kind of the weakest color. It's understated, and you would much rather play other things if you've got them.
Broken Wings is always a sideboard card for the most part, unless it's a artifact enchantment specific type set. This is not. It's a core set. Don't play this unless you put in your sideboard.
So Genesis Wave's an interesting card. 3 green, X, reveal X from library. You may put any number of them with amount of value X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then put cards revealed this way that weren't into the graveyard. So, this is just too expensive, basically. That's what it's a really good effect if you could get it to go off for like 4 or 5. But if you're doing this for 2, you're going to look at 2 cards, probably not get to put them onto the battlefield unless they're lands, in which case, sure, it's getting you extra lands, but it's not worth the place in the deck, right? There are better cards to play. If you've got a ton of ramp, and I mean a ton of ramp, you might consider this card because it could be a decent finisher. If you can get it off for, like I said, if you've got 8 mana and you can cast this where X is 5, that's pretty decent. And you may actually be able to use it to basically win the game. But that's going to be a niche circumstance. In every other circumstance, it's probably just not worth the mana.
Up next, we have the ramp, but not very good ramp. It's Grow from the Ashes. It is nice that when you put the lands onto the battlefield, they're untapped, so you can play other things, but still, it's just too much mana to do the thing. There's not enough reason to ramp in my mind. I'd rather have my my cards impact the board in ways other than ramping lands.
Right. The niche case for this is if you're in green and you're splashing another color, this is not as terrible. Right. There are other ways to get your lands though. We've got Evolving Wilds here, so just play Evolving Wilds. But if you can't and you absolutely need to splash something, this is an option. But we've seen the pay 3 to put 2 lands into play tapped, and that's just better.
I haven't found much reason to splash in this set either.
That's true too. Yeah, I don't think there's a ton. There are some really powerful bomb multicolored cards, and I could see certain circumstances if you're able to get one of those and you have one of the colors and you can maybe splash the other, it might be worth it. This set is splashable with all the dual lands and Evolving Wilds. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's most of the bombs are double mana of whatever color they're monocolored, and they cost double mana of whatever color they're in, and that makes it really difficult.
Yeah, I almost feel bad on some of my Duskmourn advice because I was advising people to pick lands early, which was right there, but I wonder if they're applying it here, and I don't think it's as right in the set. I don't see a whole lot of reason to be splashing around too crazily, and I'd rather just make sure I get my 23rd, 22nd playable in when I can.
So in multicolored, we first have Good Fortune Unicorn. I mean, again, in theory, really good effect, right? If it sticks around. But this dies to stab. This dies to the lightning bolt, and your opponent's probably going to use it on it. So you've essentially spent 3 mana, and if it sticks around, great. It's great, but it probably won't.
Wardens of the Cycle. This might also be one of the cards I am most overrated in the set to begin with. 3/4 for 4 with the Morbid effect. Morbid's hard to trigger, but it does do a couple of good things here. It does the draw a card, you lose a life, you get card advantage, and if you are low on life, gaining life is very helpful. So I don't know that I would quite even call it a D. I do like being able to trade off my cards in black and green, like the Burglar Rat or Llanowar Elves, for cards later on after they've had their impact. So I do kind of wonder if this is just not being played with the right support. That said, black-green is one of the worst archetypes as well, and I do think it gets pulled down from that.
Yeah, Agree completely. Now, if you can get your Infestation Sages and your Infernal Vessels as well, like this is actually a really good card because if you get it out, you have to dare your opponent to block you, right? Like you are daring your opponent to block your creatures, and then you are going to be able to trigger that morbid effect pretty reliably because your opponent's going to die, right? You put your opponent in a really bad position because they have to block at that point. Otherwise they're going to die, and when they do block, you're just getting another creature and triggering your morbid. So I would say the best case use for this is if you can get like 2 or 3 copies of Infernal Vessel and Infestation Sage, this becomes a much better card. But barring that, or like you said, Jeremy, if you've got your 1/1 rats, like once they get into play, they've already done their thing, then
attack in and get the damage in. So
get the damage in. Yeah.
I do think you are right to not be blocking them if this creature is out.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, you'll take the 1 damage rather than give them a card, and then hope you can kill wardens eventually, and then make their other small creatures not useful to them.
So next up, we have the other, signpost. This is a signpost rare, I guess, in green black, but says that goes to show that green black is not a particularly good archetype here because both of the multicolored cards here are rated pretty lowly. But we have Lathril, Blade of the Elves, 2/3 for 4 with Menace. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green elf warrior tokens, and you can tap this and 10 untapped elves you control to drain your opponent for 10. I mean, again, one of those things that you look at this card, you're like, wow, that sounds amazing. But how do you get 10 elves and not have this thing die in the process, right? Menace is great, but it's still just a 2/3. If your opponent has 2/3/3 creatures, or even a 1/2 and a 1/1, or no, sorry, a 2/1 and a 1/1, that's going to kill this, right? So there are a lot of ways to get rid of this, and relying on your opponent to not block it is not necessarily a really good place to be in. Now, if you've got combat tricks, if you've got other fun things you can do with this, and maybe you get it in and then giant growth it can go crazy, right? But that's going to be the exception, not the rule.
Moving into artifacts, we have Quick Draw Katana. It's overpriced equipment, and it's during your turn.
Yeah.
That's just not a good piece of equipment.
One use for this, I think, is potentially in Boros. This is actually great to draw like later in the game when you're starting to run out of gas and things to use your mana on, because you can put this on something and it's a consistent attacker with first strike. But that's the only use. The only deck that I would play this in, I think, is Boros. And other than that, I wouldn't play it. Next up, we have Campus Guide. 2/1 for 2. When it enters, you may search your library for a basic land card and put it on top. Understated, and the problem with this is you don't put it in your hand. Like, you're basically delaying yourself a draw to get a land. And there might be circumstances where you need that, but if you do, then you probably should have mulliganed the hand, and there's just better things to play.
On top of that, there's so many 1/1s going around in this set that it can block, like the Infestation Sage, the cat that draws a card, Burglar Rat. There's just so much going around that it's hard to also attack in and be able to keep this surviving. Banner of Kinship is next. When it enters, choose a creature type. This artifact enters with a fellowship counter on each of the for each of the creatures you control with that type. Creatures you control with that type get +1/+1 for each fellowship counter on it. There's just not enough of a creature type theme in this set to make this good.
I mean, there certainly is if you can get all the creatures of that type, right? Like, I'm thinking white and cats. There's a lot of cats, right? If you've got a deck and you've got 12 cats in it, and then you've got enough of the cat collector that makes more cats whenever you gain life, and you've got ways to gain life, sure, run this card. But beyond that, don't. So next up, we have Burnished Heart. This is a reprint. We've seen this before. I think it actually performed better previously than this set, but this set just it doesn't do enough for what it is. 6 mana to get 2 lands tapped is not particularly great. Sure, you can use it as a blocker and sacrifice it, but there's just better ways to get your ramp and your mana, and this is just not great.
And up last, we have Juggernaut. Again, we don't like a 4/4 for 4. We don't like a 5/3 for 4.
Yeah, and the fact that it must attack, the fact that the can't be blocked by walls doesn't matter. Your opponent's probably not going to have a wall, but what they will have is a 3/1 that costs them 2 mana, and they've traded efficiently into your 4 mana 5/3.
Yep. Next, we're going to give you our more generic thoughts on foundations. But before we do that, we want to welcome the 30% of you who joined us since the start of Foundation Spoilers. Please take a second to help us grow and tap that like button down below. It helps tell us to make more of this content for you. Now on to our thoughts on foundations. So I just want to talk a few things about foundations. One being what defines this format. And in my opinion, the format comes down to one of 2 things. And I want to see if you share that opinion, Matt.
Yeah.
All my games come down to either one of the deck goes wide and wins early through that going wide of some sort. Your traditional aggro, a lot of times this is Boros. It doesn't have to be Boros, though. I've seen it happen in Rakdos. I've seen it in other colors. But the go wide, sometimes pump up your creatures, finish off the game, or it comes down to the top deck wars of basically who has more resources the other person. And that's, I think, more often how my games have been ending. What has your feel been on that?
Yeah, I think that's largely true. I will say I tend to see a third scenario, which is, it's kind of top deck wars, but you get to a point where both sides have the ability to win, right? I get my opponent down to 7, they get me down to 5 or something. But sealing the deal is impossible without what you top deck, right? So that is kind of a top deck war situation, right? But it's an interesting one because both, like, I find myself frequently like taking big chunks out of my opponents early, and then they'll clap back and take big chunks out of me, and then it's just waiting to see who draws whatever it is to get them over the finish line.
Yeah, I guess it won't always be top deck wars. I guess I'm more
Right.
just saying it's always like attrition based. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
I have so many more resources than my opponent, and I'm going to run them out on that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how most of the games have felt to me, which I like. I like playing an attrition game. I think it's fun.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I will say one of the things I like about this set in particular is it feels back to basics, right? A lot of sets recently have had a lot of really creative, complex mechanics, which can allow you to pull off some really crazy things, right? This set feels much more back to basics, right? You got your aggro decks, you've got your control decks, and they feel like very pure aggro or very pure control decks in a lot of cases, in a way that a lot of recent sets have tended to kind of muddy the waters a little bit, right? Because you could have, like, Dustmorn, for an example, you could have green-blue control, but it was really about Manifest Dread. It was really about getting like 2/2 creatures out on the board, by using various abilities and spells, right? That you could maybe then flip over and kill your opponent with. So this feels much more pure in a lot of ways.
It feels like
and,
old
and,
Magic, like how
right.
we grew up
And I
playing.
think that was the intent of the set, right? With a lot of reprints, it's designed to be a core set to bring in new players. I don't want to say it's like dumbed down because it's certainly not. The top end is, or like the top end of the skill pool is still there, right? But it is more approachable, and I think you can build more simplified, and you can build more traditional like aggro control style decks using that. So I think that's one of the things I like. It's refreshing in some ways.
Yeah. I think what I like about that is the fact that control is more viable than it has been in a lot of sets recently. And I know we're both some of the rare podcasters that actually like aggro, but I do like playing control, and I haven't gotten I haven't fulfilled my appetite of control recently. And
right.
So this is a set where my favorite deck so far is blue-black. I love playing blue-black control in the set.
If only they'd reprinted Psychotog, Jeremy.
Right? I guess the downside, though, the set doesn't entirely speak to me in that I do like some of the more intricate things of like Duskborn, for example. I love that set, and it's not going through that intricate level. So while I like that we got to change the speed with it being slightly slower, I don't love that there's not as many synergies to explore.
Yeah. It's probably good that this set's not going to be sticking around for draft for the longest period, because I think that, yeah, it will wear itself out pretty quick, but it is a nice, like, I think it's a nice palate cleanser. Let's put it that way. You know, it'll be fun to play for a few more weeks, but then, yeah, I think it'll become like, okay, I'm ready to move on. Give me something new. Give me some more interesting strategies to play with. And, you know, hopefully we'll get that.
Yeah, I actually like releasing more sets more frequently. Like there was a long time, and I don't know, there's probably more constructed players, but there was like an overload of like how many sets were coming on out, and people got bogged down by it. But I don't know, maybe it's just because we love, playing Magic and love when new sets come on out, try new things. But I'm looking forward to having a new set in 3 weeks as well. I'm enjoying this set so far, and I guess I'm glad though that it's not going to last 2 months. That's what it is.
Although it is harder to fill out your mastery pass.
Yes.
So.
One thing I noticed, just a little bit back to maybe strategy, card draw is very limited in this. Blue has it, but it'd be nice if like black had some of the card draw that it usually has.
It does. You just got to play the right cards. Vampire Gourmand. People sleep on this card. Like it, I don't understand why I see Vampire Gourmands going 6th and 7th pick. Yeah. Like, if you're playing black, play that card. But also like, anyways, that is your card draw in black, right? Like Vampire Gourmand, Helpful Hunter in white, right? Like you've got there is card draw, but it's you got to play those specific cards. And I do think that, if you don't have those, then yeah, you're not, there's only a couple, right? So yeah. Vampire Gourmand, by the way, is an A- according to the rating.
Love that card.
Punches way above its weight in uncommon. So
and still going late.
Going late. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I know we talked about bad cards today, but man, that's a great card.
I've been playing almost exclusively black decks just because it's so open, and yeah, Gourmand is constantly coming around late.
Yeah, no, Infestations and Infestation Sage too. I just played a deck that had 3 Infestation Sages. I could have grabbed a 4th, but there was a better pick. Like, great cards going late. So
I also really like the bimodal curve in this set. So like those early drops, like your Vampire Gourmand and your Infestation Sage, and then I find at the 3 and 4 drop slot, I'm wanting to play my removal spells, and then I want late game in order to take over the game as well. So I want my 5 and 6 drops, the good ones, as well, and then maybe even some recurring of those. But yeah, just interesting tidbit. Yeah. I'm playing a lot of 2s, and then as for creatures, and then a lot of like 5 and 6 drops, and in the middle, I'm playing more spells and removal.
Yeah, and I think that's, I don't know if that was by design or not, but I do think that comes down to there just being less removal in the 2-drop slot, right? We've really only got like 2, I guess, effectively. You've got a Braid, and then you've got Luminous Rebuke. But that's about it. I know previous sets you'll have like a sorcery speed, destroy target creature for 2 or something like that. Or other similar type things. I don't even think we don't even have the white do 3 damage to attacking creature for 2 in this. We have Joust 3.
We have it for 1.
Yeah, we have it for 1, I guess, but. But basically, I think there's just less of that cheaper removal in there, and so you're relying on your Hero's Downfall, you're relying on your Bake Into a Pie, you're relying on like the 3 and 4 drop, and so I think that just tends to naturally lead people to, think about that and say, okay, well, I'm not going to play as many 3 drops or as many 4 drops because I'm going to save that slot for some of my premium removal.
Yeah, and talking about the speed of the format, I did take a screenshot prior to the format with another friend, kind of talking through what we thought it would be. I thought it would be in the red circle somewhere here. There was kind of the groupings of the slowest sets. Did not think it'd be there. There's our more fast recent sets, and then there was right in here. It turns out the format is like right about right here. So pretty close to the middle of that. I will say I thought it might even be a little slower than that. Like it might be on the top side of this circle, but yeah, it's kind of like right in the middle to the lower side of that. It's been slower than all the recent sets like Bloomborough, you know, like Wilds of Eldraine, I think is there too. And then, yeah, a lot of the more recent ones.
Yeah, no, I think that's about right, and I think that feels right for a core set. Essentially, you want it to be welcoming to new players, and a lot of the faster sets are not because people play aggro, people get destroyed, and then they get frustrated. I died on turn 5 or turn 6, and I just couldn't get ahead. And so I think this is about right there. There's definitely not that many haste creatures in the set, so that I think tends to slow down sets quite a lot. You know, there's less opportunities, I think, for early aggression. You do have some. You have some decent blockers with 3/1s and things like that you can trade into slightly larger things. So yeah, and also, we talked about a lot of the bad cards, and a lot of them were walls, right? But the fact is that you have so many walls that tends to slow down the game as well if your opponent has one. So I think that for all of those reasons, it's probably, yeah, like you said, it's right smack in the middle, basically. Thank you for taking the time to sit with us and go over some of the underperforming cards and why they're underperforming. We hope this helps as you continue to draft with foundations and kind of learn what is good and what is not. Obviously, we could be wrong on some of these, but the statistics don't lie. We've tried to kind of give a little bit of context to that. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon talking about some of our favorite decks and favorite archetypes in the format. And then we'll also maybe give a little bit of, mea culpas for some of the cards that we may have either overrated or underrated in our initial review, and kind of talk a little bit about why we, thought they were one way, but then it played out differently. So stay tuned, hit that subscribe button to be notified when the next one comes out, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
See you in the next one.
Bye.